Today's daf is daf Mem Zayin. Tana Rabbanan. The Gemara is discussing the relationship in the Shtei Alechem of Shvuos between the Kivsei, the two Kvasim, and the Shtei Alechem, and the linkage between them. And the Gemara quotes a brisa: Kivsei Atzeres ein mekadshim es halechem ela b'shchita. So what this means is that the status of the Shtei Alechem before Kiddush is what's called Kiddushas Domim, which lends itself to Pidyon. But there's going to be a Maisa HaMakadesh, something that is going to effectuate a Kiddush on the Shtei Alechem and upgrade the status of the Shtei Alechem from Kiddushas Domim to what's called Kiddushas HaGuf, where there's no Pidyon. And the Brisa teaches us that according to the first opinion, which is that of Rebbe, the Makadesh, the Maisa Makadesh, that effectuates a Kiddush on the Shtei Alechem, upgrading the Shtei Alechem from Kiddushas Domim to a higher level of Kiddushas HaGuf, is the Shechita. And the Shechita here obviously doesn't refer to the two loaves of bread, because Lechem doesn't lend itself to Shechita, but rather the loaves of bread are linked up with the Kvasim, and once there's a Shechita of the Kvasim, that effectuates on the Shtei Alechem an upgraded Kiddush to the status of Kiddushas HaGuf. Ketzad? Now, the Brisa continues, expressing Rebbe's unique view that the Shechita is what generates the Kiddush, not the Zrika. And then the Brisa is going to quote the dissenting view of Rabbi Eliezer Reb Shimon, who holds that the Kiddush is not completed with the Shechita. It begins with the Shechita, but it doesn't really effectuate the Kiddush, but rather you need Zrika. And the machlokas between Rebbe and Rabbi Eliezer Reb Shimon regarding whether the Kiddush is effectuated through Shechita or through Zrika is going to chapen afkamina in a case where the Zrika was shalol lishma, and it was an invalid Zrika. So therefore, Ketzad, let's go through Rebbe's Shita, Shchatam Lishman, he had already a proper Shchita, Lishman, which according to Rebbe is enough to effectuate a Kiddush on the Shtei Alechem, despite the fact that Zorak Doman, I'm sorry, so first is the clear-cut case where both the Shchita and the Zrika was Lishma. However, that's Kiddush. Shchatan Shalol Lishman, according to Rebbe, and basically this introduction is not subject to a controversy. Everybody would agree that if Shchatan Shalol Lishman v'Zorak Dom Shalol Lishman lo Kiddush Alechem. So again, we have the two extremes. We have the one extreme where both the Shechita and the Zrika were proper, were valid, and they were done Lishman. Then for sure there's a Kiddush on the Shtei Alechem. And then you have the other extreme where neither the Shechita nor the Zrika were done Lishman. They were both done Shalol Lishman, and that's invalid, and that does not have the power to be Makadesh the Shtei Alechem. That's clear. What is the ambiguous case, or shall we say the case that lends itself to a controversy? That's where the Shechita was Lishman, but the Zrika was Shalol Lishman. And Rebbe is going to claim, and I'm going to first interpret Rebbe just for the sake of simplicity, like Rava. We'll see Abai has a slightly different approach, but the language of Rebbe is a bit ambiguous, and that's what leads to the machlokas between Rava and Abai how to interpret Rebbe. But again, I'm going to go ahead, full steam ahead with Rava's interpretation, that when he says halechem kadosh v'eno kadosh, what he means is that a full-fledged kiddush process has been implemented, despite the fact that the zrika was shalol lishma. The invalid zrika doesn't play a role here in this, because Rebbe Shita is that everything depends upon the shchita. The shchita is mekadesh the lechem, and we'll see the nafkaminas later on with regard to pigul and other dinim. And then I could just bracket the zrika as lo maila v'lo morid. It doesn't register here because the shchita is the makadesh. That's Rebbe Shita, and therefore the shtei lechem now achieve that transformation, that upgrade from kedushas domim to kedushas haguf. But again, we have to go back to the language of Rebbe, because Rebbe says v'eno kadosh. That's a little bit confusing. We're going to put the emphasis on halechem kadosh because the shchita was lishma, and since the shchita was valid, it does effectuate a kiddush on the lechem. But Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon Omer li olam eno kadosh ad sheyishchot lishman v'yizrok domim lishman. According to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, the process of kiddush of the shtei lechem requires that the avodos of the kvasim were done lishma, from shchita all the way till zrika. And if the zrika was shalol lishma, then the status of the shtei lechem is exactly what it was before the entire process of the avodah of the kvasim, namely it's kedushas domim, the lower level of kedusha, not kedushas haguf, because the kiddush to upgrade it to kiddush haguf was improper, invalid, insofar as we require both the shchita and the zrika to be lishma, and in this case only the shchita was lishma, but the zrika was not lishma. My time of the Rebbe, what's Rebbe based on? It's based on his understanding of a pasuk. Dichsiv, and now we're in the parsha of Nazir. In Parshas Naso, it says, "V'es ha'ayel Yaseh zevach shlomim Hashem al sal hamatzos." So you see the word zevach, which means shchita, and you see al sal hamatzos, which are the matzos, the unleavened bread that have to be brought with the aisle of the Nazir when he completes his Nazirus. And Lememra, and it's the pasuk is teaching us the shchita mekadsha. So the end of the pasuk al sal hamatzos is referring to the kiddush of the matzos, and by parallel, Rebbe is going to derive that in the case of shtei lechem, above and beyond Nazir, we have the same principle that operates, namely that the shchita effectuates kiddush. And again, when I say shchita, I mean the shchita of the shnei kvasim. For Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, what does he do with this drasha? And the answer is that he sees an extra word in the pasuk. It says, "V'es ha'ayil yaseh zevach shlomim." Yaseh is telling me something about all the asiyos. Ad sheyaseh kol asiyosav, meaning that the kiddush of the shtei lechem is only effectuated when all the four avodos were proper avodos. They were valid because they were done lishma. The Gemara now asks, let's flip it around. Rebbe Nami Haksiv Yaseh. What does he do with the word Yaseh? And Rebbe makes a very subtle diuk here. It depends on the sequence of the words. Iksiv had it written in the pasuk, Zevach Yaseh, which means that the word Yaseh would have come right after the word Zevach, then Kidduka Amrit. Then I would accept you, because your interpretation would then be correct, that the Zevach is the Shchita, the first Avodah, but the Yaseh tells me to add to the Zevach the other three Avodos, including and culminating in Zrika. But Hashta D'chsiv Yaseh Zevach, now the Pasuk switches the order and the Yaseh comes first. If the Yaseh comes first, then it's not referring to Kol Asiyosov, because the next word that qualifies Yaseh is Zevach, which is Shchita, is Bameh Yaseh Bezvicha. So what effectuates the Kiddush? It's just the zvicha, otherwise known as the shchita. Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon haksiv zevach. I mean, after all, the Torah puts an explicit emphasis on the shchita. And the answer is, Hahumi boilel Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan kol mod mishitzarch she lechem b'shah shchita. Meaning that even Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, who puts all the emphasis on zrika, as far as the process of linking the kvasim with the shtei lechem, nevertheless he admits that the lechem has to be in existence at the time of the shechita. So again, let's just emphasize that shechita does play a major role, even according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, but only as far as one din is concerned, that the shechita of the kvasim is only valid if the shtei lechem is extant at the time of the shechita. Okay, now we go back to Rebbe. What did Rebbe mean? Did Rebbe mean that the shechita per se of the kvasim effectuates the kiddush of the lechem? My kadosh v'yeino kadosh. But yet Rebbe employs a very ambiguous terminology that it's kadosh, but it's not kadosh. Abai is going to put a tremendous emphasis on the two extra words, v'eino kadosh. And we'll see the nafkamina of emphasizing the eino kadosh as far as pidyon is concerned. We'll see that in just a minute or two. And therefore, Abai says kadosh v'eino gomur. It's not a complete kiddush. Meaning it does not effectuate a transformation, even according to Rebbe, of Kedushas HaDamim to Kedushas HaGuf. And basically, according to Abai's interpretation of Rebbe, although there is some Kiddush element that was generated by the Shechita Lishma, but nevertheless, the Lechem still remains and is identified by its old original status as Kedushas Damim. And therefore, according to Abai's interpretation of Rebbe, pidyon is operative, because pidyon is meaningful for Kedushas Damim, not for Kedushas Haguf. But Rava has another take on the Eino Kadosh. She's going to put all the emphasis on the word Kadosh. And therefore, Rav Amar Kadosh, period, put a period after the word Kadosh, which means that the Shechita Lishma, as a valid Shechita, generated an upgrade of the Kedushas Shtei Lechem from Kedushas Damim all the way to Kedushas Haguf, which means that the Shtei Lechem are not subject to pidyon. And what's the Eino Kadosh is Eino Nitar. Now, Eino Nitar means that the Kohanim are not allowed to eat the Shtei Lechem. Normally, the Shtei Lechem, if the process of the Kvasim was completed, Kedas Ukedin in a valid way, then the Shtei Lechem becomes mutter through the process of the Avoda and the Kiyum Korban of the Shtei HaKvasim, and then the Kohanim can eat it. But in this case, that the total Avoda from A to Z of the Shnei HaKvasim was not done properly, because the Zrika was Shalol Lishma, then even Rebbe would agree that the Shtei Lechem are Asur B'Achila, there was no Matir. Because we need for that Matir that all the Avodos of the Shnei HaKvasim should be Ksheros. And now we're talking about a case where the Zrikas Domi was Shalol Lishma. Now, let's make a point of the fact that don't walk away with the misimpression that Rava is the one who says Eino Nitar, and Abai would disagree. Abai would also agree that Eino Nitar. That's not an issue. So within even Rebbe Shita, where the Kiddush was effectuated by the Shechita, And Abaye agrees that some element of Kiddush was meaningful through the Shechita Lishma, but nevertheless, since the Zrika was Shalol Lishma, the Shtei Alechem does not become Mutter B'Achila. That point is going to come up again in the Sugya later on. My Beinayu. Now the Gemara is going to flesh out the difference between Abaye's take of Rebbe and Rava's take of Rebbe in the case of Pidyon. La Abaye, and here the correct girsa is Lo Tofas Pidyono. No, I'm sorry. According to Abaye, Tofas Pidyono, take out the word lo, because according to Abaye, Kadosh v'eno Kadosh in Rebbe means that Rebbe held that the Shechita per se is not sufficient to upgrade it to Kedushas Haguf, and therefore remains Kedushas Damim, and as such, it lends itself to Pidyon. Again, keep in mind, Pidyon usually means that you transfer the Kedusha over to another object, and therefore the original Kedusha is gone. But keep in mind that even Abaye, as we said before, agrees that the Shtei Alechem are also B'Achila. So when the Gemara says that according to Abaye, Tofas Pidyon, or the Pidyon is meaningful, it's only as far as let's say the Mos, that the Kedusha is now Chal on the Mos. It's not going to change the status of the Shtei Alechem. The Shtei Alechem are Osir. L'Rava, according to Rava, Lo Tofas Pidyono, because now Rava holds that the main emphasis of Rebbe is on the Shechita. The Shechita generates the Kiddush and upgrades the status of the Shtei Alechem to Kedushas Haguf, and Kedushas Haguf does not lend itself to Pidyon. The Gemara asks the following question: Bishleim Rava Hainu Deika Bein Rebbe LeRebbe Lozer Reb Shimon. I could understand the controversy between these two Tanoim. Why? Because, as we said in Rava's frame of reference, there is no Pidyon on the Shtei Alechem since the Zrika was Shalol Lishma. I'm sorry. Since the Shechita was Lishma, that's what I meant to say. According to Rebbe in Rava's frame of reference, the Shechita was Lishma, and that engenders a full-fledged Kedushas Haguf to the Shtei Alechem, such that now Pidyon is impossible. Whereas according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, there's no Kedushas Haguf in the Shtei Alechem because Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon requires all the Asios, meaning even the Zrika will participate in clinching the Kiddush of the Shtei Alechem. And since the Zrika was done Shalol Lishma, therefore the Shtei Alechem remain Kedushas Damim, and as such lend themselves to Pidyon. El Abaye mai ika bein Rebbe l'Reb Elazar Reb Shimon. But according to Abaye, who says that it's a low-key machlokas, meaning that Rebbe, to a large extent, goes along with Reb Elazar Reb Shimon, insofar as Abaye's take on Rebbe is v'lo kadosh, right? V'eno kadosh, that's the clincher, which means that there's not a full-fledged kiddush, and therefore, in that sense, according to Abaye, there is Pidyon, even according to Rebbe. So now Rebbe and Reb Elazar Reb Shimon have no argument because they both agree that Pidyon is meaningful. And why is Pidyon meaningful? Because it remains Kedushas Damim. And that's the Eino Kadosh in Rebbe according to Abaye. And the Gemara answers that Ika B'nai Le'ifsale B'yotze. Rebbe, even according to Abaye, does have, as the first word of Rebbe is Kadosh, he does have, to some extent, an effective generation, if we could call that, generated Kedusha to the Shtei Alechem, insofar as there is some element of Kedushas Haguf through the Shechita Lishma, and therefore Rebbe would say that now, if the Shtei Alechem are taken out of the Azara, we have a Psul Yotze. With regard to Kedushas Damim, there is no Psul Yotze. And therefore, according to Abaye, Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon is going to say that even if you take the Shtei Lechem out of the Azara, there's no Psul in the Shtei Lechem. Shtei Lechem remain exactly as they were, because their status, since the Zrika U'Shelo Lishma, is that of Kedushas Damim, and Kedushas Damim doesn't lend itself to a Psul of Yotze. Okay, I think I could go on, meaning I think the first part of the next sugya I do understand. I'll tell you where I drop out, so to speak. Boy minei Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yitzchak mi Rabbi Chia bar Abba. So we should remember the name Rabbi Shmuel bar Rabbi Yitzchak. He's the one who raised the question, and Ravina and Rav Sheshes, excuse me, is going to try to understand and interpret his question. Kivsei atzeres sheshchaton lishmon v'damin shelo lishmon. I mean, this is the case that we've been dealing with. He shechted the kivsei atzeres lishma. The dam was nizrak shelo lishma. Also alechem mal bachila. Now, we've already clarified that even according to Abaye, the lechem cannot be mutter b'achila because there's no matir, because the zrika is required to be matir the lechem b'achila. Like, for example, in zvachim in general, where you have a murim that are brought on the mizbeach and the basa that's eaten by lamazag and the kohanim, in the case of kachim kachim, the zrika is what clinches the matir. And therefore, I'll leave the man. I don't get it. I'll leave the Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, the Omar Zriki Mekadsha. So then it's obvious that according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, there was no kiddush of the Shtei Lechem. Why? Because the Zrika was Shelo Lishma. And Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon holds that in order to be Mekadosh Lechem, you need both Shchita, right? Kol Asiyos, both Shchita and Zrika. And here the Zrika was Shelo Lishma. And if the Zrika was Shelo Lishma, then for sure it goes without saying that what you're left with is Kedushas Damim. And Kedushas Damim, if you eat it, you violate Me'ilah. And Iya Liba de Rebbe, then Bein Labai, Bein Larava, Kadosh Ve'eno Nitar, who even Abai agrees that according to Rebbe, there's no matir to allow to Achila. So what was going through the mind of Rabbi Shmuel when he said that maybe you're allowed to eat the Shtei Lechem when the Zrikas Adam was Shelo Lishma? Ella, says the Gemara, leave it the high time. There's a third Tana. Besides Rebbe and Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, there's a third Tana, and that's Rabbi Akiva. The Tani we learned in a brayso that was taught us by Avud Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, Shtei Lechem sheyotzu bein shchita lezrika. So now the Shtei Lechem are subject to a psul of yotze because they were taken out of the azara after the shchita, before the zrika. We'll see what that means later on. But vizorak daman shel kvasim chutz lizmana. Now, what's going on over here? A shchita, or for that matter, a zrika that was done with the machshava and the kavanah of chutz lizman generates pigul. And now the question is, will the Shtei Lechem be subject to pigul? Now, as far as the kvasim are concerned, there's no question there's pigul. If you eat a kazayas of the boss of the two any of the two lambs, the kvasim, then you'll be chayiv kares for pigul. That's upgrade. That goes without saying. The question is, what's the status of the Shtei Lechem as far as pigul is concerned? Meaning, does the machshava of chutz lizmano of zrika generate pigul on the Shtei Lechem? Rabbi Eliezer Omer ein bo lechem mishum pigul. Meaning, this is Rabbi Eliezer, not Rabbi Eliezer Reb Shimon that we spoke about before, but Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion that you cannot have pigul once there's a psul. Pigul only applies when everything is in place, everything is kosher v'yosher, it's valid. Now you have machshevas chutz mano that generates pigul. But in the case of the Shtei Lechem, they were taken out of the Azara. They are possible b'din yotze. You cannot effectuate pigul on something that's already possible. We have no trouble with Rabbi Eliezer. But Rabbi Akiva disagrees, and he says, Yesh bo lechem mishum pigul. Okay, so now we have Rabbi Akiva's unique shita that even though the lechem was taken out of the Azara and it's possible within Yotze, nevertheless, the Zrika somehow, magically, still impacts on the Shtei Lechem. And therefore, if the Zrika was done with the Machshav of Chutz L'Zmano, it generates Pigul on the Shtei Lechem. And we're not bothered by the fact that the Shtei Lechem are already possible, midin Yotze. And now, we have to go back and explain the brisa of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, and then we can understand the suffix of Rabbi Shmuel. Omer Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes says the following: the machlokas here between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, as recorded in this brisa, is all based on the shita of Rebbe. Hani Tanoim, both these Tanoim, Kirebi Sviralahu, Diyom Shchita Makadsha. Okay, now I'm not sure when the Gemara says Shchita Makadsha, if we're going like Rava's interpretation of Rebbe. I'm not sure, but that would make, intuitively, that makes more sense. Okay, so now we're saying that Shchita is Makadish the Shtei Lechem. If Shchita is Makadesh the Shtei Lechem, then how do we understand this machlokes? Miu, Rabbi Eliezer l'tamei. Okay, now we have to introduce another statement of Rabbi Eliezer in a different context. The Omer ein zrika mo elis liyotze. That if you have something that left the Azara, then the zrika cannot effectuate an iser pigul, a chalos pigul, because of the machshava of, at the time of the zrika of chutz l'zmano, Rabbi Kiva l'tamei, Rabbi Kiva di Omar, zrika mo elis liyotze. And therefore, Rabbi Kiva holds that the zrika, if it was done machshavas chutz l'zmano and effectuates pigul, will effectuate pigul even on yotze, which I find very strange. He says on the bottom here that Rabbi Akiva maintains that. Oh, okay. So really, in order to understand Rabbi Akiva, you have to know more about Yotze, meaning Rabbi Akiva's argument against Rabbi Eliezer really revolves around Yotze, meaning the relationship between Pigul and Yotze. What do I mean by Yotze? Yotze is not a psul begufo. Rabbi Akiva would hold that Pigul cannot be effectuated and be chal after a psul if the psul is begufo. Like, let's say, for example, it became tameh. But if, on the other hand, the psul is extraneous to gufo, like, for example, yotze, where the carbon is in perfect shape, but just it left the azara, then Rabbi Akiva holds the zrika is meaningful, and in this case, to effectuate pigul, on that which was yotze, because it's not a psul begufo. And that's all based on a sugya back on Yud Beis. Okay. So once again, as we're about to start Mem Zayin Amud Beis, let's just summarize the machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Elazar, which Rav Sheshes invokes, about the psul of Yotze, as to whether or not the zrika, which was done with a machshav of chutz l'zmano, could effectuate pigul on that which is Yotze and possible, where Rabbi Akiva also agrees to Rabbi Elazar that you cannot effectuate pigul on something that's possible, but only, according to Rabbi Akiva, only if the psul is begufo. And we gave the example of Tomei. But if the psul is chutz legufo, then Rabbi Akiva holds that such a psul cannot undermine the power of zrika to effectuate pigul. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer says no, it's a chok v'lo yavar. It's an absolute rule. Anything that's possible is not affected by the zrika of chutzuzman.